Parsha Shoftim introduces us not only to the religious leadership of the Jewish people, but also to the political leadership structure envisioned by the Torah as well. And therefore we read in the beginning of the Sheni Aliyah in Parak Yudzayin, Pasuk Tezvav, after the Jewish people have entered and settled the land of Israel, Som tasim alech hamelech asher yivchar Hashem lokecha bo. You shall sorely appoint for yourself a king who Hashem will choose from amongst you. And this Pasuk serves as the basis of the mitzvah of appointing a king, as the Gemara in Masechta Sanhedrin, Daf Chaf, in the Rambam at the beginning of Hilchos Malachim codifies, when the Jewish people enter, conquer, and settle the land of Israel, they are then obligated as a nation, as a whole, to fulfill three mitzvos: appointing a king, as we just read, eradicating Amalek, and eventually building the Beis HaMikdash. So the first half of the pasuk, Som Tasim Alech HaMelech, is the source of that very important mitzvah. However, in a fascinating passage, the Oznayim Torah, by Rav Zalman Sorotzkin, he explains the second half of the pasuk, the continuation of the pasuk, as, in his opinion, a description, an allusion to what qualifications, what characteristics we should be looking for when we have to choose a king. What is important, what should we think about when we choose a king? So the continuation of the pasuk reads as follows: Mikerav achecha tasim alech hamelech. This person, this king, should be somebody who comes mikerav achecha, from amidst your brothers. That's who you should have as a king. Lo tuchal lo seis alecha ish nachri. It cannot be a person who is a nachri. Asher lo achicha, who is not your brother, who is not achicha. And in this brief passage, the Oznayim Torah makes 3 points on those words, on that second half of the pasuk. The first point he makes is, he just assumes that this second half of the pasuk is describing a situation when there are no longer any Nevi'im. Prophecy has ceased to exist. Now, I'm not aware of any earlier authority who makes this point. It could be that there are other Mefarshim who say that. I just didn't see it. But I think, even without a source, and he does not cite a source for his assumption, but I think it seems, in his opinion, obvious, because if the second half of the pasuk is telling us what to look for in a king, well, that only is relevant if we don't have a Navi, because if there's a Navi, then we don't need to know what to look for. The Navi will tell us who the right person is to be the king. And in fact, that's clearly what the first part of the pasuk is referring to when it says, Asher yivchar Hashem lokecha bo. Hashem will choose who the king is. And how will we know who Hashem has chosen? Through the Navi. So if the second half of the pasuk is talking about what we should be looking for, obviously, says Rav Zalman Sorotzkin, is talking about when there is no longer a nevuah. That's point number one. And then he says, okay, well, what do we need to know? What do we look for? So he says, well, the continuation of the pasuk, so the first thing we read is that this king, this person should be mikerav achecha, from amidst your brothers. What does that mean exactly? So he quotes the short observation of the Medrash in the Sifrei, who says that Mikar B'Chacha means Hagar Be'eretz Yisrael, someone who lives in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, Mikar B'Chacha doesn't just mean someone who is coming from a large group of Jews, which hypothetically could be anywhere in Chutz La'aretz, but rather Mikar B'Chacha in the most formal and intense sense in Israel, which is Kol Kulo, where Achecha are, where the Jewish people are. Someone who's coming from there, the midst of that, Mikar B'Chacha, that is who the king will be. Now, why is that important? Why is that necessary? So Rav Sorotzkin assumes that even though we're talking about a political leader, the king, but this is describing not the political benefits of having a king coming from Eretz Yisrael, but rather the religious virtues. After all, we know that Chazal is replete with many, many different statements, not only extolling the religious virtues of Eretz Yisrael, but in some cases even harshly criticizing the situation outside of Eretz Yisrael. And in fact, he quotes one of the more famous ones, which describes someone who lives outside of Israel as Domeh k'mi she'ein lo Eloka, as if he or she doesn't have a God. And even if we assume that that is a hyperbolic statement on the part of Chazal, its intent is still clearly conveyed. And that is that the place for maximal religious growth and a relationship with Hashem is only in Eretz Yisrael, and whatever one could accomplish in Chutz La'aretz, there's a certain limit that does not allow you to truly have a relationship with Hashem the way one could have potentially if you live in Eretz Yisrael. And Rav Sorotzkin assumes that that's also why it's important to have a king coming from Eretz Yisrael, because even though he's going to be the political leader, but the political leader of the Jewish people should be a religious role model as well. After all, he says, Eich yimloch al Yisrael kadoshim. How could anyone think that someone who didn't live in Eretz Yisrael, who has that ability to maximally benefit from the spiritual properties of the land of Israel, how could someone who didn't have that possibly be the leader of the holy Jewish people? Now that fascinating insight that the political leader needs to be someone who has access to and is tapped into the spiritual nourishment of Eretz Yisrael is confirmed and only strengthened by Rav Sorotzkin's explanation of the continuation and the conclusion of the pasuk, which we read that the person who you choose cannot be ish nachri asher lo achichahu. And we would have simply understood that is coming to preclude the possibility of a non-Jew, a nachri, a goy, being the king. However, Sorotzkin says that cannot be what the Torah means, because it's obvious. Who would have thought? What kind of havamim would anyone have that you could appoint a non-Jew to be the king of the Jewish people? That a mitzvah of the Torah could be fulfilled by appointing a non-Jew to be our king? Rather, he says that can't be what it means. The Torah, in fact, assumes obviously the king is going to be Jewish, and here the pasuk is telling us that you can't appoint someone who is he explains poetically, a nachri l'ruach Yisrael v'toraso. Nachri literally means a stranger. And here, says Rav Sorotzkin, it means a stranger, someone who is estranged from the spirit, the values of the Torah and the Jewish people. Someone who is unfortunately not particularly religious and observant. That person who may have plenty of other skills, maybe a great leader, and a political visionary, and a great organizer or speaker, really, sincerely, nevertheless is ineligible to be the king. Someone who's a nachri l'ruach Yisrael v'taraso, that person simply is not the right role model, cannot be the leader of the Jewish people. In fact, he points out that the Targum, Yonasan ben Uziel, actually in his Aramaic Targum, his translation of this pasuk, says on the word nachri, he explains that to be gever chiloni, using that similar term we're familiar with in the modern context of a non-religious or secular Jew. And therefore he says, anyone who is mitnaheig not al pi derech Torah, that person could not possibly be the king. In other words, you have a fascinating interpretation that the king, who's the political leader, must be a religious role model who lives in Eretz Yisrael and who lives al pi ruach HaTorah.